meant supporter of James. I'll talk a bit more about it in a moment, but I'm going to ask my colleague here to give you a little bit of brief sort of history and the connection with the Jacobites, if you wouldn't mind.
Give me a 2-minute thing over it.
Scone Palace was actually rebuilt after a troop from Dundee came up and destroyed the original.
Dundee, see, nothing but trouble, yeah.
But 1500 years ago it was the capital of the Picts. Intervening centuries, it's been the seat of Parliament, the crowning place of the King of Scots, including Macbeth and Robert the Bruce. The last coronation in Scotland took place at Scone in 1651, and King Charles II was crowned King of Scots. We're here today to concentrate on another visitor with royal connections, Bonnie Prince Charlie. 1745, Charlie came to Scotland to try and regain the crown for his father. It was whilst Charlie was in Perth, raising more troops for his campaign, that he came and visited the palace. I'd now like to invite my fellow clansmen to explain the weapons, terminology and equipment a soldier, or Jacobite volunteer as they were called, would use. So Mike, if you wouldn't mind.
Right, first of all, difference of uniforms. I'm actually dressed as an officer in the Jacobite army. Now the officer would usually be educated in places like Edinburgh or Glasgow, but if he came from a clan he would speak English, normally Latin, but also Gaelic. And I'm going to mention a few names in Gaelic as we go along, just about the different objects I'm going to show you. The reason I would dress like this is because I'd be in a horse. I'd be quite wealthy, I could ride around the horse. These poor men had to walk everywhere. The gentlemen are wearing traditional garment of the Highland clans. Again, I'll explain a bit more about that in a moment. But they're all Jacobites, and you know they're Jacobites because they wear in their hat a badge called a white cockade. Traditionally a white ribbon, knotted together to symbolise a white rose. When Bonnie Prince Charlie was on his way to Perth, he stopped at a place called Fessy Fern and he picked a white rose from the bushes round the house, put it in his hat. The Highlanders took it as a symbol and adopted this as their emblem. So you knew you were a Jacobite supporter by the fact you wore one of these in your hat. Now these men are actually from different clans. Normally they're fighting, but I've got them to come along and help me out because they've been united under the Jacobite cause. You're quite happy to help out with the man here, are you?
I don't really like him.
You don't like him? Why?
I mean, his clan came down our glen, stole our cattle and our wives.
Stole your cattle and your wives?
We want our cattle back.
Well, if you just put your differences aside now, just so we can get on with this. Right, I'd like to show you some of the weapons. Can I start off with a claymore, if you wouldn't mind, my friend? This is probably one of the most famous weapons of the Highland clans. It's the famous Scottish claymore. More, of course, in Gaelic means big, so it simply means the big sword. Originally a weapon like this would have been designed for medieval times when you're cutting through vests of chainmail and armour. But the Highland clans continued to carry it right up to about the Battle of Sheriff Muir in 1715. Now, as you can see, it's a two-handed weapon, and this meant, oh, dramatic picture. Hurry up! There's a camera, I take it, is it? Like you're reading a book there. Two-handed weapon. The problem about it was when you went into combat, you couldn't carry a shield. So the sword was designed in a particular way. The top part of the sword was razor sharp, but the lower part was often blunt. And the reason for this was so you could grip the blade. If you're in the midst of combat and someone swung a big heavy sword down towards your head, you grip the blade and use it like a stick to block the blow. When your enemy's sword landed here, you would use the cross piece to knock his sword to the side. The metal pommel could then be used to smack him on the nose. He then falls back upon the ground, you whack him with the sword, and all the oozing bits come out. You had your breakfast? Now, people often asked us, how did they carry such a weapon around? As you can imagine, if you stuck it into a sword belt, it would have dragged on the ground when you walked. And you couldn't just simply pop it onto your shoulder like this. If you'd been walking down a busy street one day, someone talked to you from behind, you look right to see who it is, you've chopped some poor passer-by's head off. So you had a thing called a baldric. The best way to describe this, a large leather sheath would go over the blade with a rope that went from the top to the bottom. You placed the sword into the baldric, looped it onto your back like so. You could then walk around like this quite comfortably, and if you were suddenly attacked, you'd take the sword off your back, remove it from the scabbard and use it for the fighting. Now that's how most people would have used this weapon. There was another man who used it slightly differently. His name was Mel Gibson. Now some years ago you may have seen a film called Braveheart. Now I have to tell you, Mr. Gibson got quite a few things wrong in that film, but he did do something quite dramatic that nobody else in the world can do. And if by chance you ever see the film again on television, it's worth looking out for it. During one of his battle scenes, you see Mr. Gibson with a claymore on his back. All very authentic. But halfway through the scene, he actually draws the claymore from the baldric like that. It's physically impossible. Your arms would have to be 5 feet long to get the sword out. And that does rule Mr. Gibson out, for he's only about that tall. But you had to take the sword off your back, remove it from the scabbard before you could use it. Now eventually, this would become outdated, and it would be replaced with another weapon, which is often confused with the claymore, which is the basket broadsword. I'm going to ask my colleagues if you wouldn't mind, just to grab you a bit of weaponry. Now, the Highlander has the sword. Now, I'm just going to get my tip for this. The basket broadsword traditionally is the weapons of the Highland clans, used right up to the Battle of Culloden in 1746. This sword would replace the claymore. People often think they had claymores at Culloden, but they had long gone, about 50 years before the battle. As you see, it's got a round basket to protect your hand. There's a little back guard to save your wrist, and on the front are these two small lugs. Now, they're not for decoration. If you imagine for a moment, this is your opponent's sword. If you were to get his sword to slide down your blade, you could trap his sword between those lugs. Then you could twist the sword out of his hand. The basket can also be used to punch him on the nose in a tight fight. Don't even think about it. Now, the Highlander uses this with two other main weapons. A round wooden shield called a targe. The targe is covered in leather and heavily studded. And often it would even have deer skin on the back of the targe to give it a bit of extra padding. Now, behind the targe they carry a long bladed knife called a dirk. Now, we know quite a lot about the Jacobites in 1745 because of a gentleman called Chevalier de Johnston. He was one of Bonnie Prince Charlie's aides-de-camp, like an advisor. He actually wrote a book about it, describes in detail how the clans fought in battle. What they would do, first of all, is the dagger, the dirk, was held behind the shield with the bottom end sticking out. This was used to cut towards your opponent's body in battle. But the Highlander had almost like a three-way fighting motion. He would push you off balance with his shield, cut to your body with the knife, then slice you down the middle with the sword. And you fell into two bits. So they used this technique right up to the Battle of Culloden, as I mentioned, in 1746. However, the one advantage the Highlander did have against a redcoat soldier at the time was that the redcoat often had a bayonet fixed on the end of his gun. When he was fighting with a Highlander, his first instinct was to try and stab the Highlander with the bayonet. Of course, the clansman then knocks his bayonet away and cuts towards his body with the sword or knife. Very effective fighting technique. But the Highlanders would also use muskets and pistols. Right. Okay. This is called the Scottish Doon pistol. Come quite close, you can have a look at it. They made them in the town of Doon, close to Stirling. And you can see it's rather different from any other style of pistol because it's made entirely of metal. It doesn't have a wooden handle. But this came out by pure chance. The blacksmith in the town of Doon decides to make some pistols. When he finished it, he thought, oh, that's quite heavy. I don't think anyone will buy that. So he put it on the wall of his shop and forgot all about it. But one day a wealthy clan chief was riding through the town of Doon and his horse lost a shoe. While the chief was getting the shoe put onto the horse, he noticed the pistol on display and he bought it from the blacksmith and asked him to make him some more. Within a few years, this became a very popular item for the Highland clans to have. Two reasons they liked it. First of all, being made entirely of metal, it's very hard to break. This meant if you didn't have any ammunition for your gun, you could turn it around and smack people on the head with it. But the clever feature was this, and it's quite hard to see. There's a tooth running down the side. Now, prior to this invention, which was a Scotsman who invented it, a pistol like this would have to have been tucked into your belt, like so. This made it rather difficult to get it out in a hurry. But by putting the tooth on it, you simply hang it on your belt. So if you were actually walking down a busy street of Edinburgh and you were suddenly attacked by a mean old Highlander, just like you could quickly pull your pistol from your belt and fire it at your attacker. But if you missed him, you could then club him with the pistol. So it was a very effective tool to have indeed. So that's your famous Scottish Doon pistol. But there was another weapon, however, which was the musket. Now, traditionally, the muskets that were used by the redcoat soldiers were called a brown bess musket. But the Highlanders liked to use the French-style musket. What's this? This is what they often fired from their gun. I know it's quite hard to see. It's a lead bullet. In that form, it looks pretty harmless. but it was of course as deadly as a gun today. Now traditionally, if you were a Highlander, there were a number of ways you could use and fire this gun. First of all, you could have a powder horn, or you could actually pre-make a cartridge up. Now, redcoat soldiers used to make their cartridges up, and they'd put the lead bullet in the top, and the gunpowder would be in the bottom. A Highland clansman often had this, which is called a powder horn. Now, the cow was a very important animal to the Highland clans, and if they killed the cow, they didn't waste any part of the animal. Now, they just cork the end up and put the gunpowder in there for loading and firing their gun. Right, a couple of things to point out first of all. This bit at the front is called the flash pan. Have you ever heard the phrase, a flash in the pan? This is where it originated from. Now we're going to imagine the Highlander wants to fire his gun by using a cartridge. So he takes the cartridge and he bites the end off, opens up the flash pan and puts some powder into the pan itself. He then closes the lid down and that traps the powder inside. Then he has to bring the gun down and place the rest of the cartridge into the barrel. Taking out what's called the ramrod, you would ram it all the way to the bottom. Bear in mind, of course, this has all been done in the heat of battle. He then replaces the ramrod, and in theory the gun would have been ready to fire. He would have pulled back the hammer and squeezed the trigger. Don't worry, he's not going to fire. Held just in here is a piece of flint, and when the flint would come forward, it would knock the top of the pan and cause a spark. That spark would ignite the powder in the flash pan, travelled through the small hole to the rest of the powder in the barrel, and the gun went off. Seems a little bit complicated. Well, it's true that a Highlander was actually quite a good shot with a weapon like this, and the reason he was because he used this for hunting and not just for warfare. The redcoat soldiers, they reckoned they could load and fire this gun 3 times a minute, which is pretty fast. But there was one slight disadvantage. When a redcoat would fire a musket, the gunpowder would explode, and it was quite common to burn the side of the soldier's face. It also later, because of the poor quality gunpowder, would cause a disfigurement upon the soldier called peppering. The poor quality gunpowder burnt into his skin and left an effect like pepper upon his cheeks. Now, you weren't normally allowed to have a beard in the redcoat army, but later the soldiers would be allowed to grow their facial hair, but only on the side of their face to protect them from the discomfort. Soldiers later called their facial hair side burns, and that's where the phrase originated from. So side burns were grown by soldiers to protect them from the flash in the pan from a Brown Bess musket. They were not invented by Elvis Presley, as he believes. Give me that. Right, not all the weapons were as fancy. Now, okay, Scottish people, do we know what we've got in my hand here? Go on, what's it called? Skean-dhu. Does anybody actually know what it means, however? Oh, you're so close, sir. It actually, in Gaelic, it means the black knife. It refers to the fact the handle is made of black bogwood. Now, people make skean-dhus at all kinds of different things these days. Traditionally, if it wasn't made out of black bogwood, it wasn't a proper skean-dhu. Also, the Highlanders used to carry it in a breast pocket of their jacket or coat. Most people tend to stuck them in their sock these days. This was, of course, simply a tool for cutting and eating your food. It wasn't actually a weapon, but it could be used as a weapon, but only as a last resort. Well, I'll give you a scenario. First of all, there's a great tradition in Scotland, the Highland host of hospitality. You could turn up at anybody's house, knock up on the door, and the Highlander would allow you to come in his house and welcome you and feed you as best you could. So let's imagine that you are a miserable old clansman living at the end of the glen. Nobody likes you. Okay? I turn up at your door, and I come to your door and he gives me a Highland welcome.
What do you want?
Listen, it's raining rather heavily. Could I come into your house and shelter until the storm goes by?
Oh, I suppose so, but you have to put your weapons at the door.
And that was the tradition. You were not allowed to go into his house carrying any weapons. Your pistol, your sword was all left at the door. The only thing you're allowed to carry in the house with you was your skean-dhu. Now, this is actually quite handy because you could then lay this upon the table and it would indicate to your host they'd like something to eat. So now he asks me an old traditional question which he answers himself.
You have had your tea.
I haven't actually. Any chance of a bite to eat?
Do you smell the venison cooking?
You have venison?
Aye, but it's not for you. There's a wee bit salmon for you.
Oh, right. Now, I've just been insulted. Salmon in the 18th century traditionally was called a poor man's food, peasant's food. The wealthy people of Edinburgh would never eat it. So if you give your guests salmon, you're kind of insulting them. But you might be enjoying a little bit of salmon and someone else comes into the house who doesn't like you. Sees a chance to attack you when you have no weapons. You can be someone else.
I'm somebody else.
Right, so you're eating your meal. Hey, stop annoying me, I'm trying to have my dinner here. Well, you're forced to resort to an old Highland trick. You grab your antagonist by the ear, stab him in the neck, push him out the way and carry on with your meal. So even though it's not a weapon, it could be used as a weapon, but only as a last resort. Oh, speaking of food, you want to show the bowl and such like? Now a Highlander would carry a number of items with him wherever he went. He would have a wooden bowl and a cup. You know, like you see. Okay, right. The bowl, of course, made from wood, and the cup is... Yeah. Now it's a cow horn cup. Now we do a lot of talks to school groups, and one day I asked a school class that says, does anybody know what that cup is made from? Little girl put her hand up and says, please sir, I know the answer. I says, tell me young lady, where does the cup come from? What is it made from? She says, it's made from an elephant's tusk. And I thought, I have to educate this young lady. I says, please tell me where you see elephants in Scotland. She goes, Edinburgh Zoo. Perhaps you're right. Now, the cow horn cup was for drinking, and of course the bowl was for eating, because the Highlander carried, on you go.
This is my sporran here, and my sporran. I've got bits and pieces, musket balls and everything. And I've got some oatmeal for up in the hills. Wee bit of oatmeal in there, mix it with some water, and that's me got my type of porridge. And maybe a wee touch of whiskey. Whiskey. Nice. No thank you.
Alright. Okay, something slightly less dramatic. This is probably what most traditional poor Highlanders used to wear upon their feet. Now it's a simple idea. Curran or brogue is often referred to. As you can see, it's just a piece of leather stitched up the back. Now if you're a poor Highlander and perhaps you might walk down from Inverness to Perth, the first thing you did when you arrived in Perth is you got yourself a new pair of shoes. So you headed for the Skinner Gate, those who are familiar with Perth. That's where all the shoemakers used to be. But you couldn't maybe buy a new pair of shoes because they were quite expensive buckled shoes. So you go to the tanner, the shoemaker, and ask for some leather. You buy the bit of leather from him, go outside, take off your old shoes, take out the lace at the back, spread the pattern onto the leather, cut out the shape of your skiing do, punch the holes, you've made yourself a pair of shoes. After the Battle of Culloden, lots of Highlanders moved off to America and Canada, but they continued to wear these things and put them on their feet. People used to approach them to ask them what they were wearing. The problem was that most of the Highlanders who left Scotland after Culloden couldn't speak English, they could only speak Gaelic. So people would wander up and say to them, what are you wearing on your feet? Well, of course the Highlander didn't understand the question, but he'd look at where the man was pointing and he would answer in Gaelic. Now if you're a Gaelic speaker, you often make it short and sweet. And he simply said, moccasin, which is Gaelic for my foot. And that's where we get the word moccasin. Don't know if you heard the word before, but it's actually a Gaelic word. It's all down to a misunderstanding that the Highland clans took to America and Canada, and that's where it came from. But the one thing that made the Highlanders so different was the way in which they dressed. I need to volunteer for this. You'll do. Titfall, what's your name, young lady? Come on out here now. Now, what I'd like to do to kind of finish